Hi everyone, this is EDIT 5100, Chapter 6, Assistive Technology to Enhance Communication. The importance of communication part 1, so there'll be another part following this. A student who cannot hear a teacher's question will not be able to answer the question or communicate understanding of the subject matter. And that's just really true. If you're not reaching a student, they're not going to be able to learn, to process, and stuff like that. A student who cannot hear a fellow student's comment in class or at the lunch table will not be able to carry on a conversation, enjoy that social interaction. So then, of course, obviously that also is a major part because school is where a lot of people learn how to communicate effectively or not so great, right? So obviously if there is a student with a disability, we want to make sure that they have accommodations so that they are able to communicate to other people, so that other people are also able to learn about the differences when someone has a disability so that they can understand how to adjust and also include people within a group and not exclude them just because they feel like they can't talk to them or something like that. Problems students who are deaf or hard of hearing have with communication. For those who are students who are deaf, they have little or no functional hearing, not highly skilled or comfortable with speaking, communicate primarily through sign language, and requires an interpreter to communicate with non-signers in participation. So that's for students who are deaf. Students who are hard of hearing do not typically use sign language, understand speech through a combination of personal hearing aids and lip reading. And this is one reason why sometimes you'll see me not move around, because I actually have the accommodation where the student is requesting that I don't walk around so that they can see my lips, so that they can read my lips when I am lecturing. May have some speech impairments, usually can speak well enough to be understood, and more people are having cochlear implants. So the link that you see right here is basically a link for a definition of what cochlear implants are. If you don't know, I actually suggest that you stop this lecture right here and then watch the cochlear implant thing. It's only like 2 minutes long, maybe less. And it talks about, exactly what happens that causes a person to need a cochlear implant and what the cochlear implant replaces when it comes to the human body. Guidelines for using listening devices. Number one, become knowledgeable about the assistive listening device. So if you're given the name of the product, I would highly suggest that you either Google or YouTube. YouTube is always a lot more easy because there's someone already talking to you and telling you about the product, how to use it, maybe with the pros and cons, and comparing it to other similar products. Two, discuss how the assistive listening device will be used with the student ahead of time. 3. Position the microphone carefully. It should be 3 to 5 inches away from the teacher's mouth. So usually you'll see either a headset or you'll see it on a lanyard. A lanyard is basically kind of like a thick rope necklace that people usually have keys attached to it or their ID badge. So that lanyard can be it can be clipped onto the lanyard. 4. If using speakers, consult with an audiologist about optimal positioning of the speaker. So you want to place it in a specific area so that the students can learn and hear, or hear and then learn at an optimal level. So it might be somewhere in the middle of the room as opposed to the back of the room or wherever it is. 5. Inform the entire class how the assistive listening device will be used in the classroom instruction. Remind the students to speak one at a time. Be sure to repeat questions and comments from the other students. When possible, pass the microphone transmitter from student to student. And that's a really helpful piece of advice. As a teacher, sometimes I'll be in a lecture hall and a student will make a comment who is very soft-spoken at the front area of, let's say, the classroom, the front left. The people in the back right might not have heard it, so I usually will just repeat the question. I don't necessarily ask the student to say it again because sometimes if they have a low voice or a soft voice, it's not really going to help, right? So I usually just repeat it, and it becomes more natural as you do it more and more often. But you also want students to raise their hands and then speak, or have them raise their hand, then you will point to them and then they'll speak and stuff like that. Another example would be I've actually had classes where the teacher is, let's say, has a hearing impairment, and so he will wear his hearing aid, and then he has a little microphone that is basically kind of like Wi-Fi or Bluetooth attached to it. So then the students will pass around a microphone. And so as the students talk, the teacher can actually hear it because his headset or his hearing aid has been amplified enough so that he can hear, so they can hear respond from there. 6, try to face the student in case he or she relies on visual cues to aid in understanding. And like I said before, that is, some students are actually lip reading. So you'll see sometimes students, as their accommodation, is for the teacher to not move around or to lecture while they're writing on the board because that's the back of their head, right? So then the student can't hear. I know some teachers love to walk around, but depending on the accommodations, you'll realize that some teachers actually stay still. 7, perform a listening check with the equipment regularly. Establish and follow a regular maintenance routine such as charging the batteries. And that is something that is so important, is that the batteries do not die in the middle of class or something like that. So always have extras or have the student bring extras. Depending on the students, they might have money to replace the batteries. You might want to think about having several sets of rechargeable batteries so that, there's always a set that's charging so that if there is one that goes down, then, another one's quickly replaced at the beginning of class or at the end of class, and so that the student can always have an optimal chance of listening to the class when they're in school. Communication problems in school. Although hearing aids may be adequate in one-on-one conversations, the poor acoustics of a classroom lessen the hearing aid's effectiveness. Things such as cement floors and walls, noisy heating and cooling systems, a lack of soft materials to absorb sound, and if the teacher speaks quietly. So these are things that make the conditions of the acoustics, or basically the sound in a classroom, poor or harder for a student to hear. If a student turns his or her back to the class to write on the board, the student who is lip reading can no longer hear the lecture, as we said before. Hearing lectures with assistive listening devices. So assistive listening devices are also known as ALDs, reduce the effect of an acoustically unfriendly room. So they'll catch a desired sound as cleanly as possible. They amplify it for the student who are hard of hearing. They minimize background noise such as chairs moving, fans, motors whirling, students talking, overcoming the weakening effect of sound traveling through the air. So for example, a student who's sitting all the way in the back, reducing the effect of poor room acoustics. So those are things that you want to consider and understand why an assistive learning or an assistive listening device is so helpful for some students with hearing impairments who are deaf. Types of assistive learning devices or assistive listening devices. The first one is the FM system. So if you want to, please pause right now and then actually watch this clip because it actually just explains a teacher using this specific thing in the classroom. And you'll notice where her speakers are and how she uses it, her pros and her cons as well. But anyway, so when you come back, I'll just continue with this lecture. Teachers wear a wireless lavalier microphone clip on his or her lapel or blouse. So again, it's just basically a clip of the microphone. It could also be a headset, although a headset all day might be a little painful or exhausting on the ears. Small transmitter worn on a belt or a waistband. And then the student wears a small receiver and some kind of coupling device. So that would be a headphone or earbuds that is connected to the student's hearing aid or cochlear implant. And when the teacher speaks, an auditory signal is broadcasted to an FM receiver worn by the student. The student hears the amplified voice, wireless unit, and battery operated, and also very, very portable. So an example of this type of thing is if you've ever been to a drive-in movie theater, imagine this. I don't know if you've ever been to one, but you should if you haven't. You go to the drive-in movie theater and you're sitting in your car, usually with your windows up, right? So how are you going to hear the audio? Are they going to like blast it over the speakers? No, usually they'll say, tune into this radio station, like, FM, whatever. And then from there, they've already broadcasted on that specific wavelength or whatever it is that radio waves are, and then you can hear it. And the same thing is happening with this, is that the student will have something that will match up with what your FM signal is that you're giving out, and then they can hear the teacher talking that way. All right, an infrared system. Again, please feel free to take a moment here to pause and then watch the YouTube video for this. It is similar to an FM system. use infrared light waves for transmission instead of FM radio waves. So that is something that's very similar to what a remote control or a garage door opener is instead, okay? So it's not an FM radio wave, instead it's something that is an infrared wave instead that you have from one device to another. Minimal distortion and internal amplifies noise, so sound quality is better than an FM. Okay, because this is more specific to you and that device there, it's not over radio waves, it's going to be a little bit more clear or crisp. Cannot travel through walls, so the student cannot be blocked by anything physical. You know how, as you know, when you're bored and you have your remote control, you ever put your hand over the top of the remote control and try to see if it would, you know, actually get to the TV? And you know how when you block it, it doesn't really work? Same thing that happens here. It does have to have a clear way to bounce over towards the device so that then it can pick up the sound waves. Induction loop system. And this one's actually very fancy, and I definitely recommend that you take a moment here to stop and then watch this YouTube video because it really is a fancy device, and unfortunately it is expensive. So you don't see this in necessarily all classrooms. It might be a dedicated classroom or the auditorium or a place of worship like a church or a temple where there's a little bit more access to money. But it's also really important to have so that, or to at least for you guys to see and be exposed to so you understand all the complexities when it comes to hearing and how it actually affects a person with a hearing impairment or is deaf. All right, once you do that, we'll come back to this lecture, which is the induction loop system uses electromagnetic waves for transmission, works directly with the hearing aid. The wire is looped around the perimeter of a space or a classroom. So basically imagine on the floor, as you saw on the video, basically kind of like a loop around the entire classroom so that the people who are sitting inside that loop can all get access to the induction loop system. Sounds are picked up by the teacher's microphone, amplified and sent through the loop, creating an invisible magnetic field. See, already, doesn't it sound like a superhero thing? A telecoil or a T-switch is in the hearing aid, receives and picks up the signal from the loop. So you just have to talk to your audiologist to turn on the T-switch on your thing so that you can pick up the induction loop. Converts a signal into sound, amplifies it, feeds it directly to the student's ear. And it's known to be very, very, very clear. And the ambient noise, which is basically the noise around the classroom, maybe the air conditioning noise or the clock or people shuffling around, you won't necessarily hear as much because you're just hearing the person who's speaking. Sound field amplification system broadcasts the teacher's voice through the loudspeakers that are mounted on the walls or ceiling, so it's a little bit more easy. And then also microphone and transmitter worn by the teacher. The Sorensen Video Relay Service, please watch this video. The SVRS connects to a regular television set and uses high-speed internet connection to relay video. Uses the VP200 to connect to a sign language interpreter, who then translates his signs orally over the phone for the intended hearing person. And the pro is that the person can use their language naturally. So what that is saying is, imagine if you want to talk to your friend. And let's say that you are nonverbal, right? So you're going to use ASL, or that's normally how you would communicate. So maybe your friend doesn't know ASL. So what happens is a third person who's in the middle between you two who does know how to is verbal, but also knows sign language. And basically that person in the middle is translating back and forth so that way you can still sign if that's how you typically do it. And then that person then will verbally tell the other person, listen to that person verbally respond back, and then sign to you. So that's something that was probably really, really popular in the 90s, in the early 2000s, and it's still popular now. However, most people that I know who are hard of hearing usually will just text each other, their friends or whatever, and then that way that communication is much more direct and faster, and some people will say more private, right? Obviously, the person in the middle is hired, so they're gonna understand confidentiality. However, you know, you can just go back and forth that way, and it'll be totally fine as well. I see that all the time as well. Sometimes a place like an OSD or an Office of Students with Disabilities will actually have a dedicated phone that allows texting or instant messaging or something like that, like a chat window, so that the other person can communicate through typing, because that's so fast and stuff like that. And also, it doesn't cost as much money as using this kind of system. The importance of communication part 2. So there are also problems students with physical disabilities or autism have with communication. The first one is dysarthria, speech disorder that are due to the inability of the oral motor muscles to move to their proper position because of neuromotor control issues. So this would be echoic cerebral palsy and spastic cerebral palsy. So what this is saying is physically the muscles in your mouth don't necessarily follow it the way to allow you to actually make noises or sounds and stuff like that. Dyspraxia is an interruption in the ability to program the position of the speech musculature. And then also, no motor planning skills necessary to express themselves meaningfully is someone who has autism. So they can physically, when you look at their mouths, they are able to, let's say, move their mouths into making sounds, but they don't for one reason or another. So problems resulting from communication problems in this area would be the inability to communicate often leads to intolerable frustrations. And I'm sure students, you guys who have worked with students with autism can understand that. There's, sometimes unfortunately, frustrations where they're screaming and yelling, temper tantrums, screaming, biting, hitting, and then of course self-abusive behavior such as hitting their heads against the wall or something like that. And it's not fun, right? And so we want to try and figure out a way to reduce this type of frustration, because what they're doing is maybe they're just saying, I'm thirsty, but they don't necessarily know how to communicate that with you because they haven't learned how to communicate with you in a way that makes sense to everyone. Right? So then, of course, if they're thirsty and no one understands it, they can get very upset because all they want to do is just get a drink of water. Technology tools that address communication problems for students who cannot speak. Augmentative communication is one of the most popular things and things that you will all probably end up working with. Augmentative communication systems can be unaided or aided. So an unaided, basically not having something to help you with, systems use only a person's body for communication. So that would be something like sign language would be unaided augmentative communication. Aided systems involve some sort of equipment piece or device. So the first one that we'll see here is the Proloquo, and the YouTube video is actually really great, and I suggest that you stop here and then take a moment to watch that video. All right, so here are some pictures of different types. So left to right is how I kind of organize this. When a child is first starting how to use communication that uses augmentative communication and it has a device of some sort or an equipment piece, they would learn on a piece of paper, maybe it's called like a PEX board, where there's like a chart with all these different things and they just point to it, or they can pick it out and then form a sentence using all the different squares, right? And then from there, there's the Go Talk 20 Plus, which is kind of like a childhood game where, you press those buttons on a book and then it makes a noise of the picture that they're pressing. But this one, as you can see right here, there's a notch on the right center area. And what happens is that sheet right there may be about lunch, right? And so you put it in there, and then whenever they press whatever is in there, it will repeat the words that are on that one. But let's say we're going to go over to recess. You can pull that sheet out and then put another sheet in that has all the different types of stuff that comes with, let's say, recess, like playing sports or running around or whatever it is. And the reason why it knows it is because there's a barcode, and the barcode is recognizing in there. So whenever sheet you put in there, it will recognize that one, and then it will say those specific things when the student is pressing. The third device is the second to the right, the third one over, is a dedicated device that is only for this type of communication. So the product is actually very expensive. It's usually $2,000 to $5,000 for this device, and it allows you to customize everything. It's all digital. So definitely, it's really great for, making sentences and then deleting or having it actually speak out as a sentence and stuff like that. And it's really fantastic. And then the one on the right after that, the fourth one, is just an iPad. And an iPad, they have people who have now developed apps that are very similar with these communication things where you can just switch it back and forth. It's very similar to the third one. However, it's really cheap. However, what's going on, the controversy behind that is that when someone buys an iPad to give to someone to use, they don't know if you're just getting it to have an iPad or if you're really going to use it, right? Because an iPad is so versatile. You can do almost anything. So that's the reason why some healthcare providers or some assistive technology funders do not want to buy you a cheap, let's say $600 iPad. They'll spend the $2,000 to $5,000 device because they know that that is the only thing you can use on there. So you're actually using it for that specific purpose. Because sometimes people go, I want an iPad, and then they'll never use that program or whatever. And so they can either block it, like when they get you the iPad, they can actually block it from having any other thing to do except for that. However, we can also just jailbreak it, right? You know what I mean, which basically means even though it's specifically intended for one thing, you can actually program it or deprogram it actually so that you can just, use it for whatever. So that's something that funders talk about quite a bit, although, what is the ethical way here? Do we spend $5,000 or do we spend like $500 for an iPad?